The wind carried the smell of dust and dry grass across the plains as the sun rose over the hills. It was the kind of morning where the world felt worn and tired, as if the earth itself had been carrying a heavy weight too long. On the edge of town, the ranch house sat steady against the horizon, the wide porch stretching out like it had been built to wait for something, or someone. A single notice had been tacked to the post by the front gate the night before, the ink pressed dark against the weathered wood. It read plain and simple: Cook wanted. The man who posted it stood with his hat pulled low, boots scuffing against the boards as he hammered the paper in place. He wasn't one for wasted words, wasn't one for wasted time either. Life on the ranch taught him both were dangerous luxuries. He had cattle to tend, horses to break, hands to hire and pay, and no patience left for meals that were half burnt or half cold. A cook, reliable and steady, was as necessary as a horse that didn't buck at the first sign of thunder. That morning, as he leaned against the porch rail, watching the land he had poured his sweat into, he hoped the notice would draw someone capable. In town, folks had already heard of it. The saloon keeper mentioned it over whiskey. The blacksmith chuckled about how many hungry men might show up looking for work they weren't fit for. By the time the church bell rang at 11, the talk had spread through the wooden sidewalks and dusty streets like wind through tall grass. Everyone knew someone would knock at that ranch gate when the hour struck noon. The only question was who. The rancher wasn't the kind of man to expect much out of strangers. He had seen too many drifters roll through, leaving with more than they came with. He had buried more than one hand who thought they could ride harder than the storm or drink harder than their own pain. Trust was a thin rope out here, and it could snap quick. Still, as the hour drew closer, he found himself scanning the road more than he cared to admit. On that same road, a wagon creaked slow, pulled by a tired mule whose ribs showed more than they should. The driver held the reins with hands that trembled slightly, though not from weakness. It was something deeper, a tiredness that had settled in long ago and never left. Beside her, a boy clutched the wooden side rail, his eyes wide as he watched the open land roll out. A younger girl sat with a doll stitched from scraps, the fabric worn thin but loved as if it were whole. Behind them, the wagon bed held only a few bundles, clothes folded neat, pots wrapped in blankets to keep them from breaking, and one wooden chest that looked far heavier than its size allowed. The widow had heard of the notice from a neighbor who had little kindness in her but enough to mention it in passing. She had not thought twice before deciding. Some choices made themselves when there were mouths to feed and no more coin in the jar. She knew what the townsfolk would whisper. A woman with no man, showing up at a ranch alone with children, was a story they would tell over and over. But she also knew whispers never filled a plate. Her children shifted restlessly as the wagon drew nearer to the ranch. The boy asked if the man would be mean. She did not answer right away. She only tightened her grip on the reins and stared at the line where sky met earth. In her chest, her heart beat a rhythm that was not fear alone, but a mix of hope and dread. So, tangled it was impossible to tell one from the other. Back at the ranch, the clock on the wall struck 12, each chime ringing out steady. The rancher stepped down off the porch and walked toward the gate. Land stretched silent around him, except for the wind sliding through the grass. Then he heard it, the slow grind of wagon wheels on dirt. He turned, squinting into the light. The sight that met him was not what he expected. Not a grizzled drifter, not a young ranch hand with a hat too big for his head, but a woman sitting tall on a battered wagon seat, her children close at her side. The mule's hooves dragged weakly, as if even the animal was worn thin by the miles behind them. For a moment, he said nothing. The widow stopped the mule just shy of the gate, her eyes meeting his. They held steady, though he could see the weight behind them. She did not speak either, at least not right away. The silence stretched between them, heavy as the noon heat. When she finally found her voice, it carried plain and true, though softer than she wished. She asked if the notice still stood. He looked at her, then at the children, then back again. Something in his chest shifted, though he told himself it was nothing more than surprise. He nodded once. The boy leaned forward, as if ready to defend his mother should the rancher speak unkindly. The girl clutched her doll closer, her eyes not leaving the stranger at the gate. The widow drew in a breath, steadying herself against the unknown. She had walked into many rooms where she was not welcome. She had knocked on doors that stayed shut. But she had come here not for pride, not for pity, but for a chance. The rancher rested his hand on the gate, still studying them. He knew what this would look like in town. He knew the kind of talk it would stir. He also knew the weight of taking on more than you planned for. But as the mule flicked its tail and the boy narrowed his eyes, he also knew something else. Whatever story was written on this woman's face, it was one carved by survival. He had wanted a cook. What had arrived at his gate was far more complicated. He opened his mouth, then stopped. The air between them thickened, carrying all the things unsaid. Behind the widow's calm voice, behind her tired posture, there was something unyielding. And behind his quiet stare, behind the dust on his boots and the calluses on his hands, there was a question he had not dared ask himself. The sun stood high, burning down over the plains, and the moment held tight, waiting for one of them to step forward. The rancher's fingers tightened on the gate latch. The widow lifted her chin just slightly, refusing to waver. The boy's hand closed into a fist on the wagon rail. The girl whispered to her doll, as if the fabric could offer comfort. The ranch had been quiet for too long. The widow had carried silence too far already. Noon had come, and so had the choice. What happened next hung in the balance, sharp as a knife edge, waiting to tip. The air seemed to stand still as the widow waited for the rancher to speak. The mule twitched its ears and stomped a hoof, but even that sound faded quickly into the heat that pressed down from above. The children looked from their mother to the man at the gate, their faces showing a mix of curiosity and unease. He studied them as if weighing not just the words she had spoken, but the truth she carried in her stance, in the way her jaw stayed set, though her hands looked tired. At last he swung the gate open. His voice was steady, though not warm. He said the job was simple: cooking 3 meals a day, keeping the kitchen in order, and making sure the ranch hands didn't go hungry when work pulled long into the night. The widow gave a single nod, her eyes not leaving his. She didn't thank him, not yet, for she knew nothing had been granted. She was still on trial. The wagon creaked forward a few feet, the mule pulling slow, and the boy sat up straighter, as though ready to help however he could. The ranch house loomed larger as they rolled closer, its boards worn but strong, the porch wide enough to seat a half-dozen men. Off to the side, the barn stretched tall, the scent of hay drifting from its open doors. The sound of cattle lowing carried faintly from the pastures, and a few riders could be seen working the herd in the distance, dust rising beneath their horses' hooves. This was no small holding. It was the kind of place that demanded long hours and steady hands. The widow felt the weight of it as her eyes swept the land. When the wagon came to a stop near the house, she climbed down carefully, her skirt brushing the dirt as her boots touched the ground. The boy followed quickly, then reached up to help his little sister, who clung to her doll with both arms. The widow straightened her shoulders, though she felt the ache in her back from too many miles on rough roads. She looked at the rancher again, waiting for his word. He motioned toward the house. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of stale bread and old coffee grounds. The iron stove stood cold, its surface dark with ash. A table sat in the center, scarred with knife marks and years of use. A few pots hung on the wall, though one had a handle broken clean off. It was clear meals had been made here, but not with care. The rancher said his last cook left without a word 2 weeks ago, and since then the men had been eating whatever they could throw together. Said it in a flat tone, but the widow could hear the irritation behind it. She glanced at the pantry shelves. They held sacks of flour, beans, dried apples, a little coffee, and not much else. She turned back to him and asked when he wanted her to start. He looked at her children then, his eyes narrowing just slightly. The boy stood tall for his age, but his clothes were patched, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. The girl held her doll as though it were worth more than gold. The rancher seemed to weigh their presence as much as their mother's. He said the job was hers if she could prove she could cook a meal fit for a man who worked sunup to sundown. He would give her the chance. Her lips pressed tight for a moment, then she asked if she could use what he had in the pantry. He gave a nod. She moved to the shelves, pulling flour, beans, and a strip of salted pork from a barrel. Her hands worked steady, not hurried, but with the rhythm of someone who had done this too many times to count. The children watched in silence as she stoked the stove and set a pot to boiling. The rancher stood in the doorway, his shadow long against the floorboards. While the pot simmered, he asked where she had come from. She did not look up from her work. She said the town was 2 days' ride east, but her voice carried a weight that told more than distance. She had buried her husband there, though she did not say how. She had left behind a house too small for survival, debts she could not pay, and neighbors who had stopped knocking once her door no longer had anything to offer. Her words were brief, but each one carried a story she chose not to share in full. The rancher did not press her, but his eyes remained sharp on her as she moved about the kitchen. The boy asked where they would sleep. The rancher replied that there was a small room off the kitchen meant for the cook. He did not say whether it would suit a woman and 2 children. He did not offer more than that. The widow only nodded as though she had expected nothing else. The girl rested her doll on the table and whispered to it, her voice too soft to catch. When the meal was ready, she set bowls on the table. The beans were simple, the pork cut into pieces that flavored the broth, the bread baked quick but soft enough to fill a stomach. The rancher tasted it in silence. He chewed slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. When he set his spoon down, he said nothing for a long while. Then he nodded once. It was enough. She would stay. The boy let out a breath he had been holding. The girl smiled faintly, hugging her doll. The widow only folded her hands in her lap, keeping her face steady. She had not come here for praise. She had come because survival gave her no other path. Still, something in her chest loosened slightly. For the first time in many miles, there was a roof overhead and work to be done. As the rancher left the kitchen, he paused at the door. He told her the land was hard, the days long, and that trust was not given quickly here. She met his gaze without flinching and said she was not asking for trust. Only a chance. When the door shut behind him, she exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging for the briefest moment. The boy came to her side, asking if they were safe now. She brushed his hair back from his forehead and told him they would see. The girl climbed into her lap, still clutching her doll. The widow held them both close, her eyes drifting to the small window where the sun still blazed across the fields. In the distance, the riders drove the cattle closer to the water troughs, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. The land looked endless, both promising and unforgiving. The widow knew they had only stepped into another kind of test. She had seen enough of the world to know every place carried its own shadows, and though the rancher had said little, his eyes had spoken plenty. He was not a man who gave lightly. That night, as the children lay curled together on the narrow cot in the cook's room, the widow sat awake by the small window, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling. A coyote howled faint in the distance. Hooves stamped in the barn. The wind shifted the boards of the house with soft creaks. She kept her hands folded in her lap, staring at the dark horizon. She wondered what kind of storms this land would bring. Across the yard, the rancher stood on the porch, pipe smoke curling into the night air. His eyes lingered on the small window, where the light burned low. He thought of the boy's guarded stare, the girl's quiet whispering, and the mother's unyielding eyes. He had asked for a cook. What had come to his gate was something far different, something that could change the way his ranch stood against the world. He tamped the pipe out against the railing, the night air heavy with unspoken questions. Neither of them slept easily, though for different reasons. The widow feared the past might find her again. The rancher feared the future might bring more than he was ready to carry, and somewhere in the silence of the plains, both knew the story had only just begun. The morning came slow and heavy, the kind of dawn where the air carried a chill but promised heat before long. The widow rose before the light touched the windows, careful not to wake her children. She moved quietly through the small room, pulling her shawl tighter, then stepped into the kitchen. The house was still, the only sound the faint creak of floorboards as she lit the stove. The smell of coffee began to spread, filling the silence with something steady. She had learned to find comfort in small routines, the bread mixing beneath her hands, the hiss of bacon on the iron pan, the rhythm of a spoon stirring beans, all of it gave her a place to keep her thoughts. While the rest of the world threatened to come undone, her children stirred. Awake, rubbing sleep from their eyes, as she set a cup of milk in front of them. She pressed a quick kiss to her daughter's forehead, whispered to her son to be patient with the day, then carried the men's breakfast out to the long table where the ranch hands sat waiting. They studied her as she entered, forks clinking against tin plates, voices lowered just enough to show caution. Men on the range had seen many kinds of strangers pass through, But a widow with children setting meals in front of them was something new. One of the older hands asked her name. She gave it plain, nothing more. They nodded slowly, as if testing how it sat among them. No one asked about the father. Out here, some questions weren't safe to speak. The rancher joined them, his boots sounding firm across the floorboards. He sat without a word, tasted the food, then gave a single nod. It was approval enough, yet his eyes, sharp as ever, didn't leave her long. He watched the way she carried herself, how her children lingered in the doorway, how the men shifted in their seats as if unsure what to make of her presence. By mid-morning, the ranch was alive with work. Riders cut across the fields, rounding up strays. Dust rose from the cattle herd as the sun beat down harder. The widow stood at the porch, her hands resting on the railing, watching the land stretch out. The boy leaned beside her, asking what kind of work he could do. She told him he was still young, but she could see the determination in his eyes. He had the look of someone who wanted to prove he could stand taller than the shadow life had cast on them. Later, when she stepped back into the kitchen, she found one of the ranch hands waiting near the door. He asked if she planned to stay long, his tone edged with something she couldn't name. Was it curiosity or warning? She met his gaze, steady and calm, and told him she would stay as long as she was needed. His mouth tightened. Then he gave a half shrug and walked off. The moment sat heavy with her, though. It reminded her that not everyone would welcome her presence. The days began to settle into a rhythm. Cooking, tending to her children, keeping the kitchen in order. But beneath that rhythm, tension coiled. She felt it in the way the rancher spoke little yet kept watching, in the way the men sometimes grew quiet when she entered, in the way her son asked questions about the work but was told to wait. The land itself seemed to carry a weight, as though it knew secrets she had yet to uncover. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, the widow carried scraps to the yard, where the chickens scratched. The rancher came up behind her, his boots soft in the dust. He asked if she had everything she needed. She hesitated before answering. She had enough to cook meals, enough to keep her children fed, but there was something missing she could not name aloud. She told him simply that she was managing. He gave a slight nod, though his eyes lingered longer than she expected. It was as if he wanted to ask more, but didn't trust the question. That night, when the children slept, she sat at the small table with her son's school primer open in front of her. She traced the words with her finger, teaching him what letters meant. Teaching her daughter numbers from beans spilled across the surface. Their laughter was soft, careful not to wake the house, but warm enough to remind her why she carried on. She felt the walls of the small room closing in, but she also felt the strength of having them close. The rancher stood once more on the porch, pipe smoke curling into the dark, watching the faint glow of the lamp through her window. He thought of the boy's sharp eyes, the girl's quiet smile, the mother's determined posture. He told himself he had only hired a cook, but he knew the truth was something larger. The ranch had always been a place of order, of routine and labor. Now something had shifted. Trouble did not wait long. Word traveled fast in nearby towns, faster than horses could ride. By the second week, men at the saloon were already speaking of the widow who had taken work at the ranch. Some claimed she was looking for a husband. Others whispered she was running from something. A neighbor rancher stopped by one afternoon, his horse blowing dust as he leaned over the saddle horn. He asked the rancher if it was true he had a woman cooking for his men, and when the answer came plain and steady, the neighbor only gave a long whistle. He warned that tongues would wag and wag hard. The rancher's expression never changed, but when the man rode off, he stood longer than usual by the gate, his jaw tight. The widow sensed the whispers without needing to hear them. She had lived long enough to know the shape of judgment. Her children asked why some of the ranch hands looked at them differently. She told them not every stare carried cruelty, though she wondered if that was true. One afternoon, as she scrubbed pots clean, she overheard two men arguing outside the barn. They were speaking low, but the words carried enough. They argued about the cost of keeping her and her children fed when times were already lean. One said the ranch needed order, not charity. The other reminded him the meals had kept them working harder than before. She paused, her hands stilling in the suds, her stomach twisting with the truth of what she had feared. She was not only on trial with the rancher, but with every man who worked this land. That night, she held her children closer. She told herself she would not let them see her fear. She had faced harsher storms, darker nights, but something about this place made her both hopeful and uneasy. The land promised survival, yet it demanded everything in return. Meanwhile, the boy grew restless. He wandered the pastures when he could, studying the riders, asking questions, wanting to learn. One of the younger hands, kinder than the rest, showed him how to hold a rope, how to throw it straight. The widow watched from the porch, torn between pride and worry. She knew her son longed to prove himself, but she also knew the risks of a boy stepping into a man's world too soon. The girl stayed closer, always at her mother's side, whispering to her doll, her eyes wide as if she saw more than she spoke. She asked once if the ranch would be their forever home. The widow kissed her cheek and said they would take one day at a time. Deep inside, she wondered how long they could stay before something forced them to move again. The rancher's silence grew heavier as the days passed. He spoke little at meals, but his eyes missed nothing. He watched the widow carry her burdens, watched her children carve their small place among the noise of ranch life, watched the way his men shifted uneasily in her presence. He had brought her into this place with a single notice posted at his gate, but he had not expected the storm that followed. And yet, though none of them would say it aloud, all felt the same truth tightening around them. The widow was no passing stranger. She had planted herself here, and in doing so had stirred something in the ranch, something that would not settle easy. The sun rose each morning, casting gold over the wide land, but beneath that light the tension grew, unspoken yet sharp. The ranch had always been a place of survival, of hard work and quiet endurance. Now it was also a place of questions. Who was the widow really? What weight did she carry from her past? And how long before the whispers of town and the doubts of men turned into something far harder to face? The answers lay ahead, waiting in the dust and silence of the plains. None of them were ready for the day those answers would come riding up the road. The days grew shorter, though the work never did. The widow rose before dawn and carried on until the sky turned dark. Yet each night when she lay down beside her children, she felt no peace. Something pressed against her chest that was heavier than fatigue. It was the weight of whispers, the sharp edges of eyes that judged, the quiet that followed whenever she walked into a room. Though the meals she served filled the men's bellies, not all of them were willing to accept her presence. The boy had grown bold, his hands roughening from practice with rope and saddle. He was eager to prove himself, eager to show the rancher he could do more than sit by. Some of the men indulged him, letting him ride a horse or watch as they branded cattle. Others muttered that a child had no place out there, that he was more burden than help. The widow saw the hunger in her son's eyes, a hunger she recognized, because she had carried it herself once. It frightened her to see it, for she knew how much the world could crush a spirit before it ever had a chance to grow. The girl stayed close, always with her doll, always watching. There was something about her gaze that unsettled the men. She was too quiet, too observant, as though she knew what people thought before they spoke it. She often asked her mother if they would be safe here. The widow never lied outright, but her answers grew harder to shape. She said they would try, and that had to be enough. One evening, the widow carried a basin of water to the porch and scrubbed her children's clothes under the fading sun. She could feel the eyes of one of the hands on her. He leaned against the corral post, chewing on a stalk of grass, his look not unkind, but not friendly either. He asked her straight if she thought she would last through winter. She met his stare and said she would last as long as she had to. He gave a low chuckle, not mocking, but not comforting. His words stayed with her through the night. The rancher himself grew more watchful, though he spoke little. He had seen storms rise from nothing but a shift in the wind, and he felt something similar stirring now. It wasn't only about her cooking or her children or the talk in town. It was the way her presence pulled at the men, unsettled their routine, brought new edges to old wounds. He had thought he was hiring help, but what had come to his gate was more like a turning point he could not yet name. Then came the rider. It was a hot afternoon, the air heavy with dust, when a stranger rode up the long road toward the ranch. His horse was lean but strong, his coat marked with the scars of travel. The man sat tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low, a rifle slung across his back. He did not carry the look of a neighbor stopping by or a drifter looking for day wages. His eyes, when he lifted them toward the house, were sharp and searching. The widow saw him first from the kitchen window. Her hand froze on the spoon she held. Something in the set of his shoulders, in the way he guided his horse, told her this was no chance visitor. Her son followed her gaze, his face tightening as he read the fear in hers. She told him to keep his sister close. The rancher stepped onto the porch as the rider drew near. The men in the yard stilled, their tools falling quiet. The stranger dismounted slow, tying his horse to the post with deliberate care. When he turned, the widow knew the face, though time and distance had carved it deeper. Her heart pounded hard enough she thought it might break her ribs. The man greeted the rancher politely enough, asking if this was the place that had taken on a new cook. His tone carried no warmth, only the cool sharpness of someone who already knew the answer. The rancher gave a measured nod, his eyes narrowing. He asked the stranger his business. The widow stepped out onto the porch then, her hands trembling at her sides. The man's eyes flicked to her, and his mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. He called her name, slow and drawn, like someone savoring a memory. The sound of it made her children shrink back. The rancher looked between them, the weight of the moment settling heavy on the porch. He did not ask who the man was, not yet. The silence stretched, broken only by the restless pawing of the stranger's horse. The widow drew a breath and said softly that he had no right to be here. Her voice wavered, but her chin stayed high. The man laughed then, low and dark. He said he had every right, more than she cared to admit. He looked at the children, his gaze lingering long enough to make the boy step forward, fists clenched. The rancher's eyes hardened at the sight, though he kept his voice steady as he asked again why the man had come. The stranger's words carried like smoke through dry grass. He claimed he had come to collect what was owed. He said debts didn't disappear just because a woman thought she could run far enough. The widow's face paled, but she stood firm. She said he would not take another thing from her. The men of the ranch shifted uneasily, their hands brushing tools, their eyes moving from the stranger to the widow to the rancher. Something unspoken pressed down on them all, the sense that the balance of this place had reached a breaking point. That night, the widow sat with her children close, her hands shaking as she braided her daughter's hair. She told them not to fear, though the boy's eyes said he already did. The rancher walked the yard in silence, his boots marking steady paths in the dirt. He could feel the weight of choice building around him, a choice that would not wait much longer. The next day, the stranger lingered near the barn, speaking with some of the hands, his words low, but his presence loud. The widow kept to the kitchen, but she could feel his shadow reaching inside, making the walls close tighter. The boy begged her to let him help protect them. She held him by the shoulders, telling him protection was not his burden, not yet. But in his eyes, she saw the stubborn fire that matched her own. The tension grew with each passing hour. The ranch hands whispered among themselves, some wondering if the stranger was trouble they didn't want to invite, others saying the rancher ought to send him on his way before worse came of it. Yet none of them moved against him. The widow knew why. Fear had a way of settling deep, and the stranger carried it with him like a second skin. The rancher kept watch, but even his silence felt heavier now, like thunderclouds gathering. He knew a storm when he saw one. He had weathered droughts and broken herds, but this was different. The storm had walked straight up to his gate and tied its horse to his post. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of fire, the widow stood at the sink, her hands gripping the edge hard enough to leave marks. She could hear her children laughing faintly in the other room, their voices light against the darkness pressing in. As she closed her eyes and prayed they would never know the full truth of the past chasing her. Outside, the rancher faced the stranger in the yard. The men gathered in a half circle, silent and waiting. The air was heavy, the kind of silence that comes before lightning cracks the sky. The widow stepped to the doorway, her children at her side, her eyes meeting the stranger's once more. Every path they had taken had led to this moment. Every mile of dust, every whispered word in town, every restless night. The truth was coming to the surface, whether they wanted it or not. And when it did, nothing on the ranch would remain the same. The air in the yard was thick enough to choke on. The stranger stood with his hat tipped low, his eyes flashing in the last rays of the sun. The ranch hands waited in uneasy silence, glancing between the widow, the children, the rancher, and the man who had come riding hard from the past. The widow felt her knees weaken, though she forced herself upright. She had run far, carried her children farther, but here was the shadow she had hoped to leave behind, standing bold as ever at her new doorstep. The rancher finally spoke, his voice even but carrying across the yard. He told the man this was his land, and no trouble would be tolerated on it. The stranger smiled in a way that cut sharp, saying he hadn't come for land. He had come for what was his. His words lingered as he looked straight at the widow. The boy, unable to hold himself back, stepped forward with his fists balled. The widow grabbed his arm, holding him close, whispering for him to stay still. Her daughter clutched the doll tighter, her wide eyes shining with confusion. The rancher's gaze softened for the briefest moment as he looked at the children, then hardened again when he turned back to the stranger. The widow drew a breath that seemed to scrape her chest. Her voice, when it came, trembled but carried enough strength to hold. She told the men gathered that she had once been bound to the stranger, not by choice, but by circumstance. He had been her husband's partner, a man who claimed debts when grief had left her vulnerable. She had tried to settle them, selling what little she had, but nothing was ever enough. He came back time and again, demanding more, taking more, until at last she gathered her children and left everything behind. The ranch hands shifted uneasily, whispers passing between them. The rancher listened with a face that betrayed nothing, but his eyes betrayed thought. I asked the stranger if what she said was true. The man laughed, not denying it, but saying a debt was a debt, and he had come to see it honored. The widow's voice rose sharper now. She said he would not take her children, nor the roof over their heads, nor the small chance at peace she had clawed from a cruel world. The boy's shoulders straightened beside her, as though he too had been waiting to speak those words. The rancher moved then, stepping closer to the stranger. His hand rested near his belt, not quite on the handle of the pistol, but close enough. The men shifted again, waiting. The stranger tilted his head, studying him, as though testing how far he might push. What happened next came as sudden as lightning. The stranger made a move, whether for his rifle or for the rancher's arm, no one could say. But the rancher's hand was quicker. In the dust and heat of the yard, the sound of steel leaving leather cracked through the air. The pistol was out, steady and firm, pointed straight at the stranger's chest. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the restless snort of the horse tied at the post. The rancher told him plain he would leave the widow and her children alone. If he set foot here again, he would not walk away. The stranger's eyes narrowed, his mouth twitching with anger. But the sight of the barrel staring him down silenced his tongue. He spat in the dirt, muttered something foul, then swung up into his saddle. He cast one last glare toward the widow, his teeth bared in a cruel grin, before he yanked the reins and rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the wide land. When the dust settled, the rancher lowered his gun, but did not holster it right away. He watched the road long after the rider was gone. The hands murmured among themselves, the tension breaking into a low hum of relief. Some looked at the widow with new eyes, not pitying but respecting, for she had stood against a storm and not bent. The widow sank to her knees, pulling her children close. Her son clung to her, his jaw still set with anger, but his arms tight with fear. Her daughter pressed her face into her mother's shoulder, whispering to her doll. Oh! The widow whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep, but in that moment they needed to hear them. The rancher walked to her then, his boots stirring the dust. He said nothing at first, only offered a hand to help her rise. She hesitated, then took it. His grip was steady, and in his eyes there was something she had not seen before, something like understanding. That night, the ranch was quieter than usual. Men ate their supper with subdued voices, casting glances at the cook's room where the widow and her children sat together. The rancher took his meal on the porch, staring out into the dark, the weight of the day pressing heavy on his shoulders. He thought about the widow's story, about the kind of courage it took to carry children across miles with nothing but grit and hope. He thought about the kind of man it took to follow her and try to strip it away. In the small room, the widow held her children as they drifted into uneasy sleep. Her son whispered that he wanted to be strong enough to fight one day, strong enough to protect her. She told him strength was not only in fists or weapons, but in the will to keep standing when the world tried to push you down. Her daughter asked if the man would come back. The widow kissed her hair and said not while they were here. She wanted to believe her own words. The days that followed carried their own quiet storms. The town whispered about what had happened, and some men came by the ranch with questions. The rancher gave them little, his voice steady as he said the matter was settled. The hands returned to their work, though some gave the widow nods of respect now, nods that carried no judgment. The boy found himself welcome in the corral, learning more each day, his face lit with the pride of belonging. The girl grew bolder, walking among the chickens and horses, her doll tucked under her arm, her laughter spilling like light. The widow still felt the shadow of the stranger, somewhere out there on the land, but she also felt something new. She felt the ranch itself beginning to hold her, as if the earth had accepted her weight. She worked harder than ever, not because it was asked, but because it mattered. Each loaf of bread, each pot of beans, each meal placed on the long table was a stake driven deeper into the soil, claim not only of survival, but of presence. One evening, as the sky turned violet and the cattle quieted in the fields, the rancher stood beside her on the porch. He told her he had hired her as a cook, but she had become more than that. She had become part of the ranch, part of what kept it steady. She looked at him, unsure how to answer. Then she simply said she was grateful for the chance. The rancher nodded, and though neither spoke more, something passed between them, quiet and sure. It was not promises, not yet, but it was the beginning of trust. Winter came, as it always did, with winds that howled and nights that bit hard. The widow kept the stove burning, her children tucked warm in their small room. The rancher rode the line, checking fences, his breath clouding in the icy air. The men worked side by side, their boots breaking frozen ground, their laughter louder now, less strained. Through it all, the widow and her children remained, no longer strangers, but part of the story the land itself carried. And when spring broke, the fields stretching green once more, the widow stood at the porch with her children at her side. She looked out across the ranch and felt the weight she had carried for so long lighten. The past had come knocking, sharp and cruel, but it had been sent away. What remained was not just survival, but a kind of hope she had not dared hold in years. The boy ran off toward the corral, rope in hand, eager to learn more. The girl skipped after the chickens, her doll trailing in the dust. The widow smiled faintly, the lines of worry easing from her face. Behind her, the rancher stepped onto the porch, his presence steady as the land itself. For the first time in a long while, she believed they had found a place where roots might hold. The ranch had begun with a notice posted at a gate, a desperate plea answered by a woman with nothing left but courage. What it became was a story of survival, of trust built where the wind and dust tested every soul, of a widow who refused to bend, and a man who learned that strength was not only in his hands, but in opening his door to those who needed it most. And as the sun dipped low, casting gold across the plains, the widow knew this was not the end of her journey, but it was the first true beginning.